Thin Wood Walls, Chapter 9. We arrived at the train station at dusk. Klamath Falls, Oregon. Still hot. Red sky to the west, but there were trees and mountains. My hopes climbed. As we boarded buses, I wondered how far we were from the camp. I sat in a front seat. I wanted to be the first to see our new home. Others seemed eager, too. As our bus growled and groaned through the city streets and onto the highway, their voices rose above the noise. By the time the bus slowed, it was dark. We had left the trees and mountains and recrossed the border to California. A faint glow hung over low hills. Everyone's eyes were on what lay outside. In the murk, it was mostly imagined. All I saw as we turned left off the road was what the bus's headlights picked out. A paved driveway, scrub bushes on either side, and as we got farther along, a sign. Tule Lake War Relocation Center. The driveway turned right. The driver stopped the bus and opened the door. A guy in a uniform and flat-brimmed hat stepped on, looked down at the aisle, then stepped off again. "Go ahead," he grunted, and the bus moved forward. Through an open gate. Ghostly lights shone down from up high. The bus hushed. My heart fluttered and froze. What I could see sickened me. Barbed wire fences strung between guard towers, hulking raw wood, tar paper covered buildings I recognized as barracks. Knots of soldiers and other uniformed men glaring at the buses as if they carried the plague, and parched soil in every direction. Not paradise. Pinedale all over again. Home. This was home. I looked behind me for Mike, Mom, and Grandmother. I knew they were back there, but the gloom, they were invisible. The bus stopped in a large space of dirt. Other buses pulled up next to ours. Soldiers met each one. I sat, waiting for my family, then I stood and followed them off into the night. We milled around, collected our luggage, listened to instructions, stood in snaky lines. Mike and I waited while Mom and Grandmother were questioned and fingerprinted like criminals. Mom forced a smile at us as a man pressed her fingers onto a pad of ink, but I could see the shine of tears in her eyes. My chest ached. When it was Grandmother's turn, she stood with her chin up, not watching. Everyone looked lost, betrayed, and in the unearthly lights, half dead. I thought of a movie Mike and I had seen. It was about this ancient dead guy who came back to life and wandered through the night under the control of some evil power. "Remember the mummy's hand, Mike?" I asked him. "Scary," he said. "Look around you." Mike studied the crowd. He put his arms out in front of him, half closed his eyes, half opened his mouth, and began stumbling around in a small, ragged circle. I laughed. Other kids laughed. Mom and Grandmother and other adults didn't. They seemed puzzled, and maybe nervous about what the guys in uniform would think. But when Mike stopped his act, the uniforms didn't seem to notice. They were busy processing other mummies, getting us ready to march off to our barracks. We walked for a long time. Weighed down with our belongings, the place was huge. Low building after low building, guard tower after guard tower, miles of barbed wire. Armed sentries spaced along it, eyeing us. And dust I could taste. A fog rolled in and hung in the air, and I imagined I was in London, seeking shelter from the rain of German bombs. But dirt caked on the soles of my shoes. I wasn't in London. At last we arrived at our barracks. The building was squat and homely and smelled of new wood and tar paper. We were assigned to a small room, an apartment they called it, on one end of the building. We walked in. There were 4 bunk beds spaced across the wood floor. Nothing else. No bed for Dad. I wondered if these people knew something. "Cozy," Mike said. I paced it off with my short legs. 8 by 10. About the size of our living room at home. Overhead there was one bare bulb. It cast our shadows on the floor. The bunks, the thin wood walls that separated us from the next room. "Inches," Mike said. "Funny," I said. "Paces." "We can live here," Mom said. "Perhaps we can get some furniture." "A table," Grandmother said. "Some chairs. It will be okay." Okay? It didn't feel okay. Their words felt like frosting on a cake made of sawdust and sand. But it was an improvement over Pinedale. At Pinedale, our room had grown so hot that the metal legs of our bunks sank into the asphalt floor. At Pinedale, spaces between the roof and outside walls allowed bugs the size of birds to swarm and creep into our room. Inside walls had been ceiling height, but there was no ceiling, only rafters and the roof far overhead. The family next door could hear everything we said and did, and we could hear them. At times, when the parents were away and the voices of their 2 boys rose like sirens, Mike would pull himself up on the wall and glare at them until quiet returned. We took bedding and a few other things from our bags and boxes, found the building that housed the bathrooms, and came back to undress for bed. Mom reached up to turn off the light. Darkness would provide our only privacy. She wouldn't complain, but I saw sadness on her face, and loneliness, and shame. I lay down and stared up into the blackness, listening to noises in our room and from elsewhere in the barracks. I awoke to daylight. Mike was in his bunk, asleep, but Mom and Grandmother were gone. I tried to guess the time. Before 7? The sun seemed low, the air was still cool. I dressed and sat on my bunk and took out my journal. I wrote of our new home, trying to be like Mom and Grandmother and say something positive. I managed only a few lines and a poem. Tule beginnings, stone-faced soldiers, guns, barbed wire, hearts full of wishes. When I returned to the journal, to my duffel bag, my hand brushed against my sack of marbles. I'd taken them out only once at Pinedale, after Mike had agreed to brave the sun. Outside, the target marbles almost disappeared in the powdery dust. We tried shooting, but the shooters dug in and vanished. A wind gusted up, blasting dirt into our eyes, turning the air brown, and I suddenly couldn't see any of my marbles. They were buried. We sifted through the dust until we found all but one, and we called it quits. When Mom and Grandmother returned from visiting, they said, we went to breakfast at a mess hall where the people from several barracks, called a block, ate. I mostly pushed my food, canned sardines, powdered eggs, oatmeal mush, around my tray. The same as I'd done at Pinedale. But Mike ate big. He was growing. We were leaving the mess hall when I heard someone call my name. I turned to see a kid running to catch up, smiling. Philip Yatsuda, from Thomas. He was a year behind me in school, and one of the kids I'd known at Pinedale. Did you just get here, Joe? He said, falling in step, breathing hard. Last night, I said. We've been here a week, he said. Better than Pinedale, huh? Still smiling. Always. Much, I said. I can't wait to see the swimming pool, Mike said. There isn't, Philip began, then glanced at Mike's face, caught his joke. There's a canteen, though. His smile widened. Lots of stuff to buy. If we had any money, I said. The smile dimmed just a little, then returned. There's a school, he said, and a hospital and a cemetery. 3 strikes, Mike said. We're out. A cemetery, I said. How long do they expect us to be here? Who would want to be buried in this place? Is that where they get the teachers, Mike said? The cemetery? He started his mummy routine again, stumbling around in the dirt outside the mess hall. Mom and Grandmother hurried on. Philip laughed. We'll see, he said. School doesn't start for a while. That's the first good thing you've said, I told him. I missed my school, but I didn't think I was ready for school taught by zombies inside barbed wire fences. You guys want me to show you around, Philip said. Sure, Mike said, and we called goodbye to Mom and Grandmother. Philip told his mom and dad what he was going to do. His mom smiled at us. Philip's smile. His dad looked us over and nodded. His face was frozen in a scowl. Philip proved to be a good guide for someone who'd been at Tule Lake only a week. We followed the fence, not too close, Philip warned, around much of the camp. He showed us the canteen, the post office, the schools, the hospital, the jail, the cemetery. At Pinedale, there had been nothing much to look at outside the fences. But here there were hills. Some even had names. Castle Rock, with its spires reaching into the sky. Mount Abalone, with a necklace of rock that gave it its other name, Horsecollar Mountain. They were brown and bare, but farther away were other hills with a few trees, and in the distance rose a snow-capped peak. Mount Shasta, Philip said. Looks close, but they say it's 50 or 60 miles as the crow flies. Or the buzzard, Mike said. I imagined walking to it, hiking through the trees at its base, splashing through its cool streams. I thought of Mount Rainier near our home, how it had hidden itself in the clouds the day we left. I longed to see it again. Philip returned us to the mess hall. In 2 hours, we'd seen most of what there was. He pointed out his barracks, just 2 away from ours, and he said he should get back. Thanks for the tour, Mike said, but we didn't get to see the pool. But you did see the cemetery. Philip left us with his smile attached. There was no place we had to be until after lunch, when newcomers were to assemble in the mess hall and listen to a welcoming speech. Mike returned to our barracks where he could escape the sun. I decided not to follow him. I'd just seen a girl emerge from a neighboring barracks and melt into a crowd of kids. She looked familiar. She looked like May. I approached the crowd with hope in my heart. I couldn't see her. Maybe I'd been mistaken. I counted a half a dozen girls her size. Maybe one was the girl I'd seen. I skirted around the swarm, then took a deep breath and plunged in, smiling as if I belonged. Some of the kids smiled back. Some of them looked familiar. From Pinedale, maybe. Joseph? The voice rose above the others. I turned, and there she stood. Hi, I said. Now that I'd found her, what was I going to say? May, I added. Somewhere between my brain and throat rose a dam. Then finally, I thought it was you. It's me, she smiled and came closer. I forgot about the crowd. How are you? I wanted to tell her not good, but better now that I'd found her. My mouth wouldn't make those words. Fine, I managed. She kept her smile glowing, her eyes on me, waiting for something. And you? I said. My everyday manners had grown rusty in 2 months. Better now that I've seen you, she said. I thought I saw you once at Pinedale, but you were far off, walking with your brother. My mother told me not to shout. You should have, I said. 2 months in the same camp and I never saw you. There were many people, she said. These are some of them, she gestured a sweep of her arm. 5,000 here, I said. A city. 15,000 here, my mother says. I whistled. 3 cities. I hadn't forgotten my arithmetic. Can you teach me to do that? What? Whistle. If I hadn't known how to whistle, I could have gotten your attention at Pinedale. Your mother would have approved of you whistling at me? I felt myself smiling at the image. Her laugh sprang from her chest, musical. You're right, but I'd like to know how. I'll teach you. We talked for a long time, but it didn't seem like it. Her family was staying in the barracks next to ours. We made plans to meet in the afternoon. After lunch, an army officer spoke to us, fast and with some kind of accent. I was full and sleepy, and what he said was aimed at the adults and went over my head like one of the small birds that had found their way into the building. I paid more attention to the birds than to the man, but the one thing he said didn't escape me. We, the Japanese Americans, were at Tule Lake for our own protection. I was a kid, but I knew that wasn't true. Any of us would have loved to take our chances outside those barbed wire fences. I looked at Mike, whose face was stony. Mom squeezed my hand. Grandmother sucked in a quick gulp of air, as if someone had just pushed her into a cold river. She let it out in a long, low hiss. I wondered if Dad was also being held for his protection. Maybe in my next letter to him I would ask, and see if the censors would let him answer. Once again, there was nothing for us to do. I returned to the barracks and sat down on my bunk with my journal. The air was heavy with heat. I remained as still as possible, but sweat oozed from my skin. My hands were wet with it, and I had to wipe them on my thinning pant legs to keep my journal dry as I sat and fingered the pages. Mom and Grandmother came in. Grandmother sat next to me and nodded at my journal. Mark Twain, she said. Her eyes twinkled. Without peeking, she watched as I began to write. As I struggled, I squeezed out a few sentences. I envied Mark Twain, his way with words. I closed the journal. I needed to get outside. I needed some air with life in it. Your father would be proud, Grandmother said. She smiled, showing off her perfect teeth. Thank you, Grandmother, I said. But I wasn't writing for my father. I was writing for myself.